Hi, welcome everyone who has joined us today. It's really nice to be talking to you all. I've got a special mention to those joining from Abbey College in Manchester. Hello, hope you're all well. I'm Dr. Sarah Powell. I'm Part 1 Director and the Director of Outreach here at Lancaster Medical School for the Sport and Exercise Science degree programme. So today, very excitingly, is the first day in a while I've travelled to the Health Innovation Campus here at Lancaster University on a very wet and windy day, but it is exciting to be back on site, and I'm really looking forward to working face to face again with the students. I hope everyone who has joined us today is safe and well wherever you're joining us from. So this is the fifth and final Inspiring Minds webinar in the Sport and Exercise Science Seminar Series for 2021. All previous webinars from our very first, the role of sport and exercise science in professional football, and why would a sports scientist work for NASA? How could a sport and exercise scientist improve a nation's health? And what has sport and exercise science ever done for us? All available to watch on Lancaster University's School Resources Hub. And I'll publish the link for anyone who is interested. As a team, we hope these seminars are keeping you motivated from home to keep on learning and achieving in your studies, but also opening your minds to the vast potential a degree in sport and exercise science could have. Today, I would like to introduce Dr. Jenny Meggs to you all, who'll be presenting on the topic of resilience in elite sports performance. And Jenny's our lecturer here in sports psychology and the lead sports psychology consultant for Swim England for the Northern regions, and part of the pre-elite Swim England and the British Swimming National Talent Sports Science support team. Jenny also collaborates in the field of mental toughness and resilience and psychosocial creative art therapy interventions. So a very exciting next 20 minutes for everybody. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the session and I will answer in the background where I can, but I'll also create a run of questions for a live session at the end with Dr. Jenny Meggs. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Jenny and I hope you all enjoy.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. That's brilliant. So just a kind of brief introduction about what I'll talk about over the next 20 minutes then. So my recent work is with the youth athletes in Swim England Northwest. So I'm very keen on making kind of sports psychology more accessible to youth athletes. And I see that as really important in then feeding into the pathways into elite sport. So hopefully there'll be something for everybody, because there might be some people who are just starting out and interested in a degree in sport and exercise science, some people who are trainee sport and exercise psychologists, or some people who are qualified as well. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone in the next 20 minutes. So in terms of, I guess, that the first stage for a sports psychologist then when working with athletes or a team is to do a kind of holistic and evidence-based needs analysis. So just to kind of give you an indication of the different tools and assessment tools we might use as sports psychologists, I've got some examples here that can be very relevant for resilience and understanding resilience. So one very common tool or needs assessment method that you're probably familiar with is the use of psychometrics or questionnaires. They're validated tools that have gone through a process of kind of evidence-based validation, and therefore can measure different traits in athletes. One that's specific to resilience in sport is the CD risk scale, and that's been more recently validated in elite athlete populations. So it can give us an indication of some of the kind of core traits or resilience traits that athletes have. So we can then understand where we're kind of starting with that athlete, and then we can also evaluate and measure change as well if we're to develop interventions or try and change the culture within a team or a sport. We also have biomarkers as well. So I've used these markers in my research and practice. One hormone that's very relevant when thinking about dealing with stress and resilience is that of cortisol. So cortisol is the hormone that's produced when we perceive a certain threat or a certain level of stress in our environment. Cortisol is released by the body, and that helps prepare our body for action so we can respond appropriately to whatever that threat might be. Another tool that we use at Lancaster University as well is the galvanic skin response measure, and that's a measure of skin conductance, but essentially that measures our emotional arousal. So it can tell us how kind of intensely emotional our experience is at any given time. So it's a very useful, more objective measure of kind of stress or intensity of your emotions. Also, we have cognitive tools as well that we can use both in laboratory environments and in the field. And this would be looking at skills or capabilities such as perceptual and spatial ability, so somebody's ability to visually detect things in their environment, to respond to those. Cognitive load as well, so the amount of information that we can hold in our brain at any given time and how we can use that information, whether we can move away from distractions and concentrate on what we need to do. And also response inhibition as well, so can we inhibit inappropriate responses? So when we feel very frustrated or angry or anxious, are we able to restrain our behaviour and control those responses? And the kind of key thing for me here is just to show, I suppose, as sports psychologists, we've got a huge range of different tools that we use, and the best and kind of gold standard needs analysis with athletes is likely to include all of those different components. It does look like they're all quite separate features, which isn't true in practice. We know that they're very interactive, so our level of cortisol will influence how resilient we are as measured by a psychometric tool. It will influence our ability to inhibit responses, to detect appropriate stimuli in the environment. So it's kind of key to look at it as that holistic overall athlete functioning, if you like. So that's the gold standard. Obviously, in terms of applying that to practice, it would always be dependent upon the resources that you have in your team or your club as to which tools that you can use with your athletes. But that's the kind of overall kind of view of the different tools that we use in sports psychology. Okay, so thinking about resilience in particular then. So resilience has gone through, I suppose, 10 years of research now. And we couldn't really talk about resilience without mentioning Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Sarkar, who are kind of two pioneers of conceptualization of resilience, both in the individual, but also in teams and organizations as well. There seems to be, like with any construct in psychology, it's complex. It can be specific to the context, it can change over time, but there does seem to be some consistency in the definition and our understanding of resilience now, which is really helpful for researchers and practitioners, that we're on the same page. We know what we're describing when we talk about what it means to be resilient. So kind of couple of definitions I've picked out then is the role of mental processes and our behaviour in promoting personal assets and protecting an individual from the potential negative effects of stress. So it's that kind of key of individual assets or personal resources that we might have, such as being optimistic, having a high level of belief in your kind of ability to deal with stress. And it's about that, an absence of a negative effect of stress. So we can still withstand pressure, withstand stress, and we can still perform consistently at that kind of optimal level. It's also seen as a dynamic process, so it's not something that's fixed in time. It's something that changes as a result of evolution over time, as well as in different contexts. And this is a slightly different definition in the sense that it emphasises that we shouldn't only be able to withstand pressure and stress, but we should also be able to experience positive adaptations as well. So can we actually improve and further develop our skills, and then therefore be better performers after experiencing adversity or stress? I think one of the kind of key things that comes out again from definitions of resilience is this idea of framing or cognitive restructuring of how we see challenges or adversities, such as the situation we found ourselves in over the last 12 months, is beginning to see that as an opportunity instead of a threat to our kind of traits or our performance. Instead, seeing it as this is a real opportunity for you to kind of develop new skills, and particularly to be continuously learning and flexible and be adaptable as well. And I think this is something of real value that coaches, sports psychologists, sport and exercise scientists can bring to athletes in the way that we model that kind of a kind of reframing of this particular experience to athletes, whilst obviously acknowledging that that's very hard as well to do at times. Okay, so thinking about placing resilience more in context then. So there was again a shift from just thinking about individuals as being either resilient or lacking in resilience, and not thinking about the environment that they're in as well. So this was a really kind of promising or reassuring shift really in the way that both research and practice understood resilience. And that's to see the key role in that environmental circumstance that athletes are in, which again we can have a real influence on. So it's quite a useful framework again from Fletcher and Sarkar 4 years ago or so, 5 years ago now, and it differentiates between these kind of 4 quadrants of environments that athletes might find themselves in. And we've got 2 kind of constructs, if you like, that determine which quadrant you would find yourself in. So we've got the challenge element that we've got there, but on the y-axis, so we've got very low levels of challenge at the bottom, moving up towards very high levels of challenge as we move up. And then we've got support along the x-axis there, very low levels of support or perceived social support, to then very high levels of perceived social support. And that aspect of perceived is key, because it has to be from the athlete's perception that they feel that the support that they receive is appropriate, is relevant, and is meeting their particular needs. So if we just look at first, I suppose the least desirable in my point of view anyway, would be that unrelenting environment. And that's where we've got a very high perceived level of challenge. So athletes perceive that there's lots of demands, there's lots of stress, whether that be internal pressures, external demands and stresses. But at the same time, they perceive that they've got a very low level of support. And in that kind of area, that's where we might expect athletes to experience things like injury, burnout, and just chronic, overwhelmed kind of states, really. So again, there'll be different ways of assessing when athletes might be in that area, but just as a framework, it's useful, I think, to consider that these 2 aspects are very important. So the ideal state that we would like to find athletes in would be this high level of challenge. So they are feeling that the demands in their environment are stretching them, are pushing them beyond their current kind of comfort level. And that, again, we don't probably have time to go into all the ways that we might develop that kind of a culture, but things like high expectations, high standards, accountability, and so on. But equally, in order that that's a facilitative environment and we're going to experience that positive adaptation and become more resilient, is we must have that high level of support as well. And again, the perception of the athlete that they're receiving the support that they require and they need is very important. The other 2 quadrants then we might see as being not harmful in terms of kind of mental health, well-being or resilience, but not necessarily bringing the best from our athletes and pushing them to a new level of resilience. So the low level of challenge coupled with a low level of support would be seen as being stagnant, so just kind of stuck in a certain kind of level of performance and not progressing. And then we've got the kind of low level of challenge and high level of support, where we feel very comfortable, we're kind of ticking along, kind of going through the motions and that kind of an experience. So the ideal kind of sweet spot where we've got the red circle would be that facilitating the high level of challenge coupled with that high level of support. And again, when we think, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the myths that around resilience that I think have been unhelpful. I think that was partly about that missing the element of the need for support. So we can push athletes, we can expect a lot from them, but we have to consider, I guess, our responsibility to give the adequate support that they need as well. Okay, so some of the myths, and I think this was really helpful to think about for sports psychologists, because again, it can be a real area that we can add value. So it is about promoting that resilience is important, and explaining what it is, but equally to challenge some of the kind of assumptions around resilience or unhelpful myths that we still see. So a few of the, or 2 that I think are kind of I see sometimes still is that resilience is a fixed trait. So it's something that's within you as an individual. You're born with a certain level of resilience, and then that's it. You can kind of accept where you are, and that's certainly not the case from the evidence base. It's something that is developed over time. It's something that we can work on, and it's dynamic and changeable. Secondly, as well, that it's a construct that's applicable, or a process that's applicable to only a special few number of athletes. And I think, again, perhaps the title of this talk kind of fed into that a little bit as well, thinking about elite athletes and resilience. So a lot of the early research in resilience was done particularly with elite athletes and only elite athletes. And I think that had an unintended consequence in the way that I guess younger athletes perceive that to be something that was superhuman, and that's not something that's available to me. So why should I engage with that kind of evidence base and those skills and strategies? So it's certainly not something that's applicable to only a certain number of very, very successful athletes. Also, then, can it be seen as, I guess, some of the, I know not philosophy students as such, but I do think there's real value in considering the frameworks in which we place sports psychology constructs. And one of the, again, I suppose, debates that's still ongoing is it an elitist ideal to think about resilience in elite athletes? So must athletes be, all athletes who are successful, are they resilient? Because there's lots of other factors that go into an athlete's success, you know, physiological capabilities, as well as access to resources and training and expertise. So is it always the case that every athlete that's successful is definitely resilient? And do you have to be resilient in order to be successful as well? So there's still questions I think are helpful for us to at least consider and think about. The next two I think are quite linked, really. So there's a bit of a shift towards thinking about resilience within a kind of stoicism framework, and in kind of Greek mythology, I suppose. So if anybody's familiar with what would be a Stoic philosophy, would be one that accepts that, you know, challenges happen within life. So kind of struggle, challenges, adversity, we're all going to face different things. And that's something that perhaps we can sensitively introduce to athletes a bit sooner, perhaps. So it's not something that's a complete kind of surprise or a shock. It's something that they recognise they will come across challenges. And also equally as well, it's not about being unrealistically positive at all times. So it can be, yeah, in some ways, I think if we're always kind of on that, let's be resilient, let's be positive, let's be optimistic, I think in some ways that can feel quite overwhelming as well. So it's, yeah, important to kind of balance that with, you will come across challenges, and it's important to think of, you will sometimes experience negative emotions as well, and that's okay. So kind of normalising that experience as well would be helpful. Okay, so next, so now we've kind of considered what resilience is, some of the ongoing debates in the area, both in practice and research. I thought it'd be helpful as well to kind of think about the, I suppose, journey that athletes might be on now, or all of us are on now, because and some of the trauma literature is quite useful in thinking about this kind of non-linear progression from experiencing something that's very difficult to then that process of growth and reconstruction and developing resilience. So if we can see on the left side of this graph, we've got the experience of a traumatic event. So the warning, the threat, and then we've got the impact of that event. And then we've got what we tend to see, or what literature has shown in kind of community resilience programs or research, is that we then experience this sharp increase in performance, in people coming together and being helpful to each other in this kind of sense of community, and what we call a honeymoon period, if you like. And then afterwards, it'd be nice if we just stayed on that kind of level. After that, there can be a period of then disillusionment, so kind of what's a sense of loss, and in that kind of change of, you know, I've lost my previous kind of sense of safety, whilst I was kind of, yeah, first of all, I was in a sense of, I can handle this, I can deal with it. It's now a bit kind of, oh, what am I doing? I'm not entirely sure. And then we'll begin to see that kind of increase in their psychological well-being and ability again to deal with stress. So again, it's not, I suppose, something to focus on too much, but just to show that non-linear trajectory that we might see in athletes, which can kind of help us normalise that we're not going to see them just kind of improve, you know, week in, week out when they return to their sports. So, and I think a key part as well of thinking about that kind of growth and adaptation after stress as well, is part of it is about kind of processing that experience and then accepting some of the very, you know, difficult things that people have experienced as well. And that kind of leads in to thinking about something that I've been very much more interested in recently, which is combining kind of creative arts with more, I suppose, neuroscientific evidence of why that kind of approach is helpful. So it seems to be then, so athletes or people in general who've been through difficult times and adverse experiences, is if they're able to find a way to kind of develop meaning from that, as well as a kind of shared sense of connection and experience with other people, they seem to fare much better than people who feel more kind of isolated and don't get past that sense of feeling a bit lost and not really understanding what's happening. So it might seem a bit of a strange addition, I suppose, for athletes to do, but it's something that is being used more in practice now. So for some football academies, for example, use an approach to help athletes develop a visual representation of how they're feeling at different times, and that can be very useful, particularly when it's something very new and we might struggle to talk about. So basically, arts is an area, whether that be storytelling or producing arts pieces, can help us kind of convey our values and our emotions. And it can also help us kind of see the differences in our experiences as well as the similarities as well, which is very important, I think, again, for athletes in this period. Athletes will be returning back to their sports having had totally different experiences. Some might have lost important people. Some people may not have done. So it's about kind of drawing between those similarities to emphasise that connection in the team again. As mentioned as well, there is a lot of evidence now evolving in different areas of psychology that show the psychophysiological benefits of creative arts. So things like the medial prefrontal cortex increases in activity when we're engaged with art and creating art, which is very important for processing memories as well as emotional regulation as well. It does seem to impact our cortisol levels as well. So when people are engaged in storytelling or creative art, they lower their cortisol levels, which again is really, really important at the moment as well when we're under so much kind of uncertainty. Another area as well that's very helpful to think about how we set up cultures within teams with athletes to make sure that they feel comfortable, safe, able to process their experiences is the literature in psychological safety, which Amy Edmondson of Harvard University has kind of developed and really brought to the forefront in the last couple of years, who is a business psychologist, but it does transfer very well to sport as well. So it's about this kind of developing cultures where people feel safe, accepted, they're able to make mistakes, they don't feel kind of unable to take risks and to be themselves. So there's that kind of research and literature is also really, really helpful as well for sport psychologists. And then lastly as well, so this kind of idea of, I suppose, as sport psychologists, as coaches, as sport scientists, is being kind of vulnerable in our approach to leadership or in the way that we approach athletes as well. So showing that we make mistakes, we have challenges, we've had struggles, and that can be really powerful as well in helping people feel safe and secure and able to be themselves. Okay, so that's me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope everyone found something useful, and I'll hand back over to Dr. Sarah Powell.
Hi, thank you very much, Jenny. Really interesting insight into the world of resilience and elite sport. And I've got quite a few questions coming in, so please feel free to keep them going. And the first one that I'd like to pose to you is, do you test an athlete on entry to a training scheme?
That's a very good question. So in terms of, again, it would depend where you work and your, I suppose, access to resources and so on, but certainly the work that I do more recently with Swim England Northwest and with the national talent team, then we'd be keen as I guess evidence-based practitioners to assess athletes at the very first point to understand what is their level of functioning. And I think that kind of first introduction section would give an idea of the way we might do that. So the different assessment tools we can use. Ones that are very, very easy to use are always psychometric tools. They're accessible, relatively easy to interpret, can be understood by many different athletes. But then equally as well, some of the kind of psychophysiological measures as well, to ensure that there is that objectivity as well in what we do as sports psychologists. So most certainly assessing athlete needs, both their strengths and their areas for development, is very important as a first step, definitely.
Brilliant, thank you. And this one kind of follows on really, really nicely. Can you give some practical tips on how to develop an athlete's resilience?
Most definitely. So I think in terms of psychologists, we have, I suppose, a toolkit of different psychological skills and strategies that we would tend to draw from with athletes, and they kind of broadly come under like psychological skills training, which would be imagery development. Don't have a lot of time to go into depth about how you would develop a program of imagery, but imagery strategies are great. Kind of self-talk or cognitive behavioural strategies around reframing and restructuring experiences to be more positive and helpful. REBT as well, rational emotive behaviour therapy, is quite a good, useful applied tool as well. So that helps athletes understand both their helpful and unhelpful beliefs that they have. So rational and irrational beliefs, and then how we can help them adapt those to be more balanced and more flexible. There's also mindfulness acceptance approaches as well, so ways that we can learn to be more present, to regulate our emotions and so on. But I've certainly got different strategies that I can share if anybody wanted to get in touch afterwards, because it's quite difficult, I think, to explain all the different ranges of tools that we can use. But yeah.
Thank you. That's a really, really kind offer there from Jenny. So if you would like to get in touch, do look Jenny up here at Lancaster Medical School. Another one on athletes. Could you give an example how resilience training has made an impact on an athlete? Don't know if you can disclose those details.
Definitely. I think just to, I suppose, broadly, the impact element is quite interesting in terms of, so I think I've always got, I suppose, two hats on as a researcher and then as a practitioner, in the sense that how do we evaluate and measure impact. And I think with a practitioner head on, I think the best impact for me is certainly athletes who report, an improvement in their functioning more broadly than just in sport as well. So if they're able to say, actually, after working with you with developing my resilience, I'm now more able to deal with challenges as they come up. I don't get overwhelmed as easily. I feel happier. I feel like my relationships are great. I feel like I'm thriving and so on. But and also in terms of, I suppose, research impact, I guess we can see kind of real meaningful change, and look at that statistically as well in larger groups and see, are we having an impact in a way that we can kind of really measure and evaluate. But I think, without kind of disclosed, I suppose, individuals, I'd say that for me, it's always about the athlete having that kind of long-term and sustained change in their experiences, really, and both outside of sport and in sport as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for giving us that insight. Now, again, another really, really good related question. Is good resilience a good predictor of performance? So this must be something that's quite important when you're identifying talent, especially in the youth.
Definitely, yeah, most definitely. So it does seem to hold good predictive validity. And another related construct as well is mental toughness, which are very similar. I think what kind of start a debate between the resilience researchers and mental toughness researchers about which one is most important and so on. But in terms of the amount of their performance potential that it can predict, then there's a kind of varied evidence from anything from kind of 2% up to 15% of their performance. But yeah, definitely it can be a very good predictor of whether somebody's likely to improve and perform well. But that's not to say, obviously, if I suppose, yeah, it's about identifying the level of that particular athlete and then introducing different strategies and tools that can be helpful. And I think, like anything, it's just identifying needs and then being sure that you're meeting those needs as well. So it is important, but it's not the only thing, and we can certainly help and support athletes with it.
Fantastic. Now, a question from Lewis says, do you have any experience on the effects of resilience on depression or depressive moods or ruminating?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of clinical levels of depression, that would be something that would be outside of the remit of sports psychologists, but we do, which I think is a really good thing now in different clubs, sorry, different national governing bodies and elite teams in particular. There will be practitioners or psychologists, psychiatrists who have experience in those kinds of domains. And I've certainly seen a lot more of that kind of integration of multidisciplinary practice at conferences, in practice as well. So yes, it certainly seems that from my observation of other people who are experienced in kind of depressive mood and so on, it can be very, very helpful. All of these strategies that would help somebody be resilient can, yeah, prevent some of those maladaptive thinking styles and rumination on negative events. So yeah, definitely.
Right, okay, now the questions are coming thick and fast. So what observable behaviours are typical in athletes who demonstrate high levels of resilience?
Great question. And again, I think it's context specific, but some of the different behavioural coding measures or approaches that I've used or seen be used would be certainly a kind of improvement in performance after failure. So whether that be, you know, as a swimmer, if I'd had a very poor race in a heat, because swimming races tend to be heat-based and then you move through to semi-finals and finals, then a behavioural indicator of somebody who's resilient could be having a poor performance. So if something goes wrong in that particular race, is then I positively adapt from that and I perform better the next time. Also, I suppose the typical things that would embody things like, or represent things like optimism. So body language and non-verbal behaviour can be very kind of positive indicators, I suppose, of resilient, optimistic approaches. But I think, yeah, it is very context specific, but with my research ahead on, it tends to be defined as that behaviour, so positive behaviour that's shown afterwards. So it could be, you know, a player has a really bad training game, they get frustrated, they behave in a way that they're not kind of proud of. The next training session, do they come back? You know, they arrive early, they're there prepared, they're asking for advice, seeking support, seeking for kind of strategies to further develop themselves. So I think it's that, yeah, kind of positive response to something that's negative. So if it's demonstrated in, you know, high levels of commitment, conscientiousness, or high performance levels, that kind of thing.
Brilliant, thank you. Now this is an interesting one. I'm not sure whether it's fully in your remit, Jenny, but do you think there's a remit for research on resilience within the esports genre? Do you think it is relevant and could it be applied?
That's very good, because it's a kind of booming field, isn't it? I think at the minute, esports, which I've only very recently become kind of familiar with. But my understanding of it, it's the essentially kind of gaming in sport. So, but yeah, I think there's very high stakes in it as well, which makes it very interesting from a psychological point of view, because there can be kind of significant financial rewards for teams that do very well. But yeah, so most definitely, because I see it as kind of the need to respond very quickly to things that might happen within gaming situations, or that, yeah, it's this kind of same psychological principles of being able to deal with pressure, high levels of concentration, being able to pick out, you know, visual stimuli that you need, make effective decisions. So yeah, I would say absolutely. And it seems that perhaps research will catch up with the applied work, because it's definitely a field that esports are very, very interested in, sports psychologists in working with them. So quite an exciting, interesting, different area, I think.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. One relates to how do you feel the experiences over the last 12 months, and obviously the pandemic, is going to affect athletes coming back to training, and how can you suggest any ways of fostering a psychologically safe environment within a sports team?
Yeah, definitely. So I think for me, I think the biggest thing, isn't it, is that sense of, and there's some recent research, mostly with higher level performers as well, but I'm sure it would be mirrored in youth sport, is a sense of kind of loss and isolation. I think that seems to be the kind of more qualitative research that's being done very recently, as well as kind of concerns, I suppose, around their performance, frustration, all the kind of typical things that we definitely expect. And I think that's why my kind of theme towards the end of the presentation was to think about re-establishing that sense of connection. So moving away from thinking about outcomes and performance, because it just is unlikely to be helpful immediately upon their return. But in terms of kind of real concrete practical things to encourage psychological safety, I think it has to come, for me anyway, from leadership and from coaches and things. So for you to show that level of vulnerability, and that you're not, and actually be comfortable with that. And then I guess a level of humility as well around not having all of the answers, and that's something that's okay, and you're kind of there to support them, you're on that journey with them, whilst you can't kind of have all, predict the future and have all the solutions. I think being open about that own personal vulnerability is the kind of key thing for them feeling safe. And I think, kind of focusing on the processes that they have to go through to kind of reintegrate into their sport, and I suppose, building those positive emotions away from, feeling risk and a sense of unsafety, which we've all kind of been encouraged to be very aware of risk. I think those would be practical suggestions, I think. So focus on processes within their sport rather than outcomes and performance goals, and then demonstrating that, you're there to support them alongside them, but you don't have all the answers, and that's okay, because it'll be fine.
Brilliant, great practical tips there. So an interesting question, because I know that there has been a lot of research done within which kind of try to classify types of athletes, especially in the elite domain. And there has been some research considering that athletes are not representative of general populations. Do you find any differences in the emotional stresses of elite athletes, or any kind of levels of maybe narcissistic tendencies for elite athletes? And have you ever seen any emotional blunted responses when doing tests such as the galvanic skin responses?
That's really, really interesting question. And we recently had a very interesting guest lecture from Dr. Robert Vaughan, who specifically works around kind of narcissistic traits and personality types within sport. And it seems that there's a kind of link with mental toughness there as well. So some of those what would be seen as being dark traits, I suppose, so kind of hyper competitiveness, that blunted, somebody's mentioned blunted emotional response, which can be indicated by a galvanic skin response tool or assessment. It does seem to be that they would be very helpful traits sometimes with dealing with pressure, because you're less likely to feel, I guess, that emotional sensitivity, particularly when there's been so much emotion around, I think, and then so many reasons, I think, to get upset for other people, is they're kind of protected from that. So there's some kind of real positive, I suppose, parts of that kind of personality construct, if you like, that would be helpful for performance. But that's a very interesting question, very good one.
Brilliant. I hope you can still see the right person at home, because it says I'm live and we've just lost our producer. So we'll fly this by the seat of our pants and hope that it will come back to Jenny. And this is a great time to ask maybe a less direct question, but a really, really interesting one, because there is somebody who would like to understand a little bit more about how you've got to where you are and how you've gained the experience that you have to work within the elite athlete field.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, in terms of my recent work, it's definitely been more in kind of youth sport, which is, sorry, to say a little bit about how I've got here. So I was a competitive swimmer when I was younger. So I was relatively successful as a youth until I was kind of 12 or 13, and a very typical kind of trajectory, I suppose. And in the sense that I experienced some poor performances, really struggled to deal with that. So that was where I always had an interest in kind of why was that? Why did I find that difficult? And a desire, I suppose, to help athletes who might experience those things as well. So I did a psychology degree, which now there is no kind of benefit of, I suppose, of doing a psychology degree over sport and exercise science, I would say. And that's just because the field's moved on such a lot within sport science. But that's the route I kind of took 15 years ago. And then I went straight on to do my PhD in sports psychology and began to do the applied experience as well, which I've now kind of done over 10 years. But I've dipped in and out of whether I've focused on teaching or more of the applied work. But I suppose for you now, things have changed a lot over the last 10 years, and there's quite a versatile number of different routes that you can take it to become a sport and exercise psychologist. And the new BASIS qualification is very flexible in allowing you to meet the competencies in different ways. But in terms of finding experience, for me personally, 15 years ago, sports psychology wasn't kind of equally valued back then, and I think that's changed massively, which is very helpful for anybody wanting to get experience. But it's just about contacting people, so using the connections that you've got, or reaching out to sports psychologists or trainees, and then just asking, can I get involved? Can I contribute in any way? And I definitely would say that if you offer your kind of skills and so on, it seems to be that athletes and teams are very keen to have sports psychology support now. So it's a very exciting time, I think, to get involved in sports psychology. So, but yeah, so I think for me, it was definitely about using the connections that I already had, and not feeling afraid, I think, to just go and offer what I thought was valuable. So kind of 22, I went to meet the director of British Swimming and just said, oh, look, I think we could do a lot of work in sports psychology. They didn't have sports psychologists at that time. And I was really surprised that he was willing to meet me in person and discuss my ideas and things like that. So I think just get in touch, and you might be surprised that people would definitely be interested and find it very valuable.
That's fantastic. Another couple of questions here, and I'm going to kind of put them all together because I think we're coming to an end of this now, but we've still got quite a long list. So is there a difference in athletes' resilience between sports? Have you ever seen a difference in the resilience shown by athletes in different sporting groups? And are there some typical things that you see, some typical traits that are evident amongst elite athletes with high resilience?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, and again, drawing on research and then just my own views, I suppose. I think there's some sports, I think, that have that, I suppose, inherent level of challenge or risk within them. So I suppose you get more extreme, risky sports. Certainly are going to kind of challenge people in terms of developing that resilience more automatically, if you like. So if that makes sense. So I suppose some of the definitions of resilience is that we have to experience stress or be exposed to adversity or risk in order to then be able to develop those skills. So in some sports that can be more obvious or more kind of inherent within the sport anyway. For other athletes, it could be, things like injury, kind of loss within their own lives, other performance challenges within that environment. So it's perhaps less obvious that resilience would be needed, and perhaps it might only come at a time when they face those challenges individually. So I'm thinking about sports that, like swimming that I was involved in, there's not a huge level of risk being in a nice warm swimming pool. So there wasn't that kind of exposure to risk and then dealing with that kind of pressure. But things like injury tended to be relatively common, and the training demands as well. So having a very intense kind of training schedule was one area that would develop resilience in that way. So I think it's very context specific in the way that resilience might develop and how and when it will be needed. But there seems to also be some consistency across elite athletes, in a sense that there aren't that many elite athletes who haven't experienced something that would be deemed to be a kind of adverse event. So whether that be, like I mentioned, a personal difficulty or particularly injuries, obviously a very common one. But yeah, and I think that's some of the work by Professor David Collins has looked at. What is it about elite athletes and how have they overcome adverse events? And it does seem to be that they've all experienced some difficulty at some point, which has probably been very helpful for their success in sport. But I think it is very context specific, and we do need to consider the need for resilience and how it might manifest as well.
Yeah, and that is a really key issue at the moment, certainly coming out of the pandemic and hopefully back to some version of the new normal and back to training. And there's a question come in which I think follows on from that, and it really draws on your answer there, about the evidence that's come to light of everything that was happening within gymnastics in the USA, and how the trauma that those athletes lived through actually built their resilience over time and came into their levels of elite performance. And I think you've answered that one really nicely. So I'm going to pose this last question, and it's a lovely one to finish on, I think, because it's something maybe that we can all do and think about to build our own resilience moving forward. And that's, can goal setting be a helpful strategy to increase resilience? And if so, how can we do it?
Definitely, yeah, most definitely. And I think I think for me, it's one of the biggest things personally, well, like you said, for everybody, has been that sense of a loss of kind of control over the last 12 months. There's been so many changes, so much uncertainty, and what kind of goal setting can do, without just kind of setting smart targets, but focusing on the kind of small processes that we do every day. And I think it can give us back that sense of, I am making progress. Well, two things, isn't it? It's kind of, I'm in control of what's happening and I am making a difference in my own life. And then equally, I am making progress as well, because it can feel a bit kind of like, what's happening? I'm overwhelmed. I'm not making any progress with anything. So I think, having a real structured and reevaluating our goals as well, because some of the things that we might have expected to achieve by now haven't been possible. But doing that in a positive way, so some new goals, so taking things that we've learned from this experience and saying, how can I build on that now and re-establish myself in terms of knowing where I'm heading towards and what my kind of dream goal is, and then those tiny processes that are going to help you get there. So I think it's very helpful to re-establish that sense of an internal sense of control, as well as a feeling of progression, which can then kind of build on that motivation as well.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I'm glad it finished with your face and didn't see me for any more time. Jenny, I'd just like to say thank you ever so much for your time today. And it's been a fantastic webinar. And I really think that Q&A has touched on some really, really important things, but a lot of practical strategies that I'm sure many of the viewers can take away and put actually into action. So it's been a real pleasure. And this talk will be uploaded along with all of the other ones on the resource hub. And I published the link right at the beginning of the talk. So please do check it out, or please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at sportsadmit@lancaster.ac.uk. If anyone has any more questions or would like any more information, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks all.